welcome everyone to Implementing a Test Automation UFT Framework in a DevOps World. I'm Ron Franklin, and I'll be your moderator today. This webinar is sponsored by Vivit and your DevOps Special Interest Group. Your leadership here is supporting a triangulation model in that we have Francesco Colavita, who represents the interest from Microfocus. We have Saeed, who represents the interest from the solution provider perspective, and myself, Ron Franklin, from the end user perspective. Francesco, would you like to say a couple words?
Yes, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Yes. So I work as a business consultant in Microfocus, and I follow the last 3 years the DevOps transformation for many customers. My daily job is to drive some webinar or workshops with the customer to start moving the first step in the DevOps transformation. And one of the subjects that we touch very often is the test automation. So I think it's enough for me now.
Okay. Thank you, Francesco. Words?
Hey, Ron. Yeah, absolutely. Hello, everyone. This is Saeed Hussain, your Vivit DevOps SIG co-leader. Delighted to be here today for the special presentation. When we were planning for our events, Ron suggested a great presentation that he's seen at a recent conference, and thought it would be a great idea if we could share it with our DevOps SIG group. So I'm glad Bob agreed to do this for us today, and really excited to be here as today's topic of UFT and test automation frameworks has been very beneficial in my career and how to accelerate quality software delivery. So I hope you all find this to be helpful as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Saeed. And so myself, Ron Franklin. So I'm work in the areas of test automation, performance engineering, operations management, and DevOps. Have approximately 30 years experience. And so just wanted to let you know that with our DevOps SIG here, that we're trying to, we've identified 3 core pillars that we'd like to bring with these presentations. One is on DevOps culture, another one is on DevOps tools, and the third is on DevOps applications and use cases. So we want to have each of these webinars so that when you go away, you have a tool, something in your toolkit that you can go to make your job better and easier. And so we're excited to be a part of this, and we thank you for coming on and joining this webinar today and being a part of that journey with us. So as I said, I'll be hosting and being your moderator today. And just a couple housekeeping items before we start. So this live session is being recorded. Recordings are available to all Vivit members. So if you want to see a large presentation screen, please click the rectangle in the upper right-hand corner of the presentation pane. So you, to see the red arrow, that'll point you to the location. So also for your webinar control panel for session questions and answers, please type it in the question and answer pane and click on Ask. You can choose the language in which you'd like to ask your question, and it'll translate. So without further ado, I'll take this over turn it over to Bob.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you very much. I appreciate the introduction, and I would truly like to thank everybody for joining us today. Hopefully, at the end of this webinar, you will feel a bit enlightened about implementing a reliable UFT automation framework. So again, my name is Bob Cruz. I am president and co-founder of Checkpoint Technologies. Also very, very proud to be a longtime co-leader of the Vivit Florida chapter. I'm also president of the Tampa Bay Quality Assurance Association. So hopefully, as you can see, that in my 29 years of IT experience, with 19 of that being in QA and quality control, I truly do have just a significant passion when it comes to quality assurance and software testing. So before we get going, I want to give everybody a little bit of a quick brain teaser to get our brain juices. Although, you know, I have to admit, I have actually found asking engineers to solve brain teasers and puzzles, I have found that to be a great way to determine if they have an aptitude for abstract thinking and creativity. Both of these are very important skills when it comes to designing and developing and implementing frameworks. So right in front of you right now, you should see a yellow bus. So question for you. If this bus were to move forward, in which direction would this bus move? Would it move in the direction of A or B if it were to move forward? Now think about that for just a moment. We're not going to do a poll, but just to add a little bit of salt to the wound, I will share with you that 92% of all first graders actually got this question correct. That not only do you get the answer right, but that you have a valid reason for choosing the answer you do. And the answer is A. So if this bus were to move forward, it would move in the direction that the A arrow is pointing. And that is actually because, as you can see, the door, or actually I should say as you don't see, the door is on the other side. So as first graders know, the door is on the other side, meaning that if it were to move forward, it would go in the direction of A. So just a little bit of a brain teaser there again to get you going. So during today's webinar, I want to share with you the necessity and value of test automation in DevOps, the elements of a successful automation framework, and the value of an automation framework, which is absolutely critical. And then also I'll be sharing with you some practical tips to design and implement an automation framework in DevOps. So why DevOps, everybody? An absolutely fantastic book that is out there called the DevOps Handbook, How to Create World-Class Agility, Reliability, and Security in Technology Organizations. So when we ask why DevOps, the authors of this book, Gene Kim, Jez Humble, Patrick Dubois, and John Willis, have actually stated that they did a survey from 2013 through 2016, and they collected data, 1,000 technology professionals. And what they found was absolutely amazing. They actually found that in those organizations, code and change deployments were 30 times more frequent. So that is absolutely amazing. And they also found that code and change deployment lead times was high. So in other words, high performers were both more agile and more reliable. And high performers deployed code 30 times more frequently. And the time required to go from code committed to successfully running in production was 200 times faster. So in addition to that, they found that high performers were twice as likely to exceed profitability, market share, and productivity goals. From a business viewpoint, it truly does make a lot of sense to move towards DevOps. So first, let me talk about, I want to get some terminology out of the way. When it comes to continuous integration, continuous delivery, and continuous deployment. So in this diagram I've got, you see two different flows, if you will. The top flow represents continuous delivery. The bottom represents continuous deployment. So now you'll notice over on the left, I've highlighted, I've shaded, if you will, continuous integration, because it's the same definition or exact same process, regardless of whether or not you focus on continuous delivery or continuous deployment. And continuous integration, that is the practice where developers regularly merge their changes into a central repository, after which automated builds and tests are run. Now, you'll notice the big difference between the two, between continuous delivery and continuous deployment, is in that process marked deploy to production. So with continuous delivery, that deploy into production is a manual process. So in other words, everything is queued up to that point, and then somebody has to make the decision, yes, I bless this, this is good, we are going to deploy into production. Whereas in continuous deployment, that is actually that process, when you're at that point, the deployment into prod is automated. So hopefully that clears up a few things for everybody. But during this webinar, I'm going to focus on automated testing. So whether or not you're doing unit testing, integration testing, acceptance testing, smoke testing, etc., it's very important to understand how the scope of testing has changed in DevOps. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I've been in IT for 29 years now. So I started off back in the COBOL days, and it used to be a lot less often, but each time we tested, we would validate significantly more revisions. So we might do a release maybe once every 3 months, once every 6 months, and whenever we had a major testing event, we would be validating hundreds, if not thousands, of different revisions. Whereas with DevOps, what we're talking about there is we are testing so much more frequently, but we are validating fewer revisions each time. So how are we doing this? We are doing it with test automation and a well-designed framework. That's really the only way you can do it. So with a well-designed framework, think about the benefits, the return on investment. When done correctly, it decreases the automated test development time. It enables the test to be created sooner, because the fantastic thing about a well-designed automation framework is that once it's implemented, you don't have to have a UI. You don't have to have a user interface. You can actually start creating automated tests utilizing the framework far in advance. As soon as you understand the process, you know what the different components or objects will be. It also decreases maintenance, and it increases test automation coverage, and it puts the power of automation in more hands. So it puts the power of automation in more hands. So what that means is that you're going to be able to find that those that are perhaps less technical, and I certainly don't mean that in a negative way, but those on your team that are less technical, maybe they don't know how to program or code, they will actually start, you will enable them to create automated tests. And they will be able to do that utilizing the front end, which I'll be discussing soon. So some fundamentals of a successful UFT framework. Let me talk about that just a little bit. But before I do, just a quick high-level, the 10,000 helicopter view of an automation framework, the definition. So an automation framework is a methodology that separates the automation code from the data, and it allows for separate development and maintenance of the two assets. So that is key. By separating the automation code from the data, then you will enable those individuals that are less technical, what I was just sharing with you a moment ago, you will enable them to create automated tests by focusing on the data. So some automation framework characteristics. If you've got a reliable, robust automation framework, these are the characteristics that we would expect to see. The code has got to be modular. So there should be no duplication, no redundancy of the code. It must be scalable. So in other words, little effort should be required to add business processes or new AUTs, application under test, to the framework. It must address error handling. So all unexpected application errors are managed by using exception handlers. Obviously, it's got to be reliable, so it's got to be designed to be robust and reliable to the point of having scripts run unattended. And then the data, remember, separated from the code, so it's managed externally to the code. Now let me talk about common elements of successful frameworks. We're going to just go over the fundamental components quickly, and then we will dive into more detailed descriptions, design tips, and some actual examples. Because our organization, we have implemented this framework in numerous companies throughout the United States. So it's got to have a simple front end, and by simple, I'm talking Excel spreadsheet simple. It's got to have a maintainable back end, and again, I'm going to be going over these different subcomponents in just a moment, but by maintainable back end, you're going to see it involves a master driver, an application driver, or drivers, excuse me, and business process drivers. And then, of course, the data. So let me go over each of these for just a moment. So the simple, that is the mechanism for creating the test scripts. So in our simple front end, each column in this slide that you see here, so you see the column password, so that represents a step or an action. So when there's data in the cell in that column, that represents entering that value into the password edit field. That's a step. And then each record is one iteration of the test. So if we had one record in here, then that record might represent that we are performing our validation for when we enter an invalid password or an invalid username, etc. The robust backend. So remember, it's got to be scalable and maintainable. The backend consists of the code in the form of drivers, process routines, and functions that read the data and execute the test. So the code reads the data, executes the test, and it handles everything possible to ensure the most successful test run. And again, it must be scalable and maintainable. So the back-end drivers, I'm going to talk about 3 of them. You've got the master driver script. So your master driver script copies the input to the execution folder. And for each row of data, each sheet is evaluated whether or not there is data in the current row. And then if there is data in that current row, obviously it executes that iteration. And it reads the sheet name and calls the appropriate application driver. And again, in a moment, I'm going to show you an example. And then you've got the application driver. So the application driver calls the automated business process related to the name of the current sheet. And then you've got your business process driver. So each step gets evaluated for execution based on whether or not there's data and based on what the data may be equivalent to. Because you might have a process in one of your drivers that says, if the value of the data equals this, go and execute business process driver A, otherwise execute business process driver B. And then report steps get written to the test results. The framework must be driven by data. So data can be in the form of input data and or keywords, and it must allow for multiple data iterations. So think about this for just a moment. As you're performing it, you want to think about multiple applications because you want your framework to be robust. If it's only useful against one application that your organization has, that's not very robust. And then you also want to make sure that it is enabled for multiple platforms. So just a quick example, maybe we want to do some cross-browser testing. So now let me share with you more about the details. I'm going to show you some examples and give you some tips relative to the UFT automation framework. And just very quickly, a few tips that we have found that I want to share with you right now when utilizing UFT to develop and implement an automation framework include, well, one is we highly recommend using a shared repository when developing a test framework in UFT. And doing this allows objects to be added or updated in a single file, which then propagates to all other tests using that shared repository. And then another common question we get is how many UFT licenses are recommended to effectively create and run tests in a framework? That is based upon, truly how many resources will be developing scripts, as well as how large your test suite will end up being. And then also keep in mind that you will likely, very likely, especially in DevOps, need to integrate UFT with other various continuous integration tools. And that's one of the many great benefits of using UFT. So for example, using command line execution built into UFT, you could execute tests in your framework using other third-party solutions. So just a few tips right there. But now let me talk about the framework features. So it's got to be keyword and data-driven based on the application under test business processes. So the business processes, that's where you would utilize keywords. And then you would also have parameters. The different type of parameters that you've got. So there is the input parameter. So just like it sounds, that's data entered into edit fields, selected from drop-down list, etc. Another parameter type would be verification. So you've got a parameter defined in your Excel spreadsheet in your front end, where that value, that parameter is the expected value, which during the process is going to be grabbed and compared to the actual results during execution time. You've got a parameter which is a decision or action, so that creates an action against an object. Maybe click, maybe select, etc. And then you've got an output parameter. So while your tests are running, you may decide that you're going to grab the actual result and you're going to write that as output into your front-end spreadsheet. And then there are low-level common functions. So low-level common functions there, I'm referring to functions that would handle all the complexities of the detailed data management or object identification and manipulation. And then there's reporting. So in other words, what you want there is, in that situation, it's going to filter through one function which captures the screenshots, writes detailed messages to the test results, and it handles critical failures, stopping test execution. So the reporting is very important because obviously, as we all know, once you've done the test execution, you've got to be able to perform analysis. So on the front end, so in the frameworks we've implemented, we've always have utilized Excel for the script design. So as I mentioned earlier, each column represents a test step. Each tab represents a business process. Each tab or each sheet, if you will, whichever term. Each business process tab contains all the necessary parameters to create both positive and negative test scenarios. And then output is captured to output parameters and can be used in subsequent iterations downstream by using an Excel formula. The great thing about this type of design is that multiple applications under test can be incorporated into integration test by adding tabs associated with other application under test. So let's take a look at this slide here. So In this example, you've got up at the top a master Excel template, and it contains all of the business process for a given application. So here you can see that you've got a login process is one tab or sheet. You've got a registration which is another. And to create a nest, all you have to do, so the idea to add or create a new test, you just have to save that master template as another file. If you want to, you can remove the tabs not required, but you don't have to, but you can remove not required for the test, would simply enter the data based on the test that they know must be performed. So in this example right here, using that top spreadsheet, you can see we might go in and we've got step number 14 is entering whatever value gets pulled off of our spreadsheet as the second answer to passcode. So in this example that I'm showing you, you'll see that steps 14 through 18 are the registration process, and then it branches into the manage profile process based off of the data in the front-end Excel spreadsheet. So see, again, your testers would actually end up creating automated test data into the front-end Excel spreadsheet. The back end, the drivers, so the master driver script, remember that contains the flow of the script based on the data. That calls the application driver scripts, which in turn call the business process drivers. And those are specific groups of steps or actions that contain all of the steps required to complete all of the business process for both negative and positive testing. Now, for those back-end drivers, the code in the form of actions, for the most part, and this is an actual example that you see right here, for the most part, they're mostly devoid of logic. They contain very simple steps referencing the object with the related parameterized data. So it's very granular. And the great thing about this is it's easy to maintain. So now I want to share with you some considerations at the component level when it comes to the design of the framework. So you want to make sure 99% of the time that you are designing the front end prior to the back end. And you would want to ask yourself, all right, who's going to be tasked with using the framework to design the automated test? It's very important to understand that. Remember, the framework must be driven by data. In what format will the test be designed? And what tool will manage the data? So you don't have to use Excel. You can certainly utilize, straight from a database where you're creating data in that manner. You can use XML. So a few different options. We have just found Excel to be one of the more reliable, and also a situation where the learning curve with Excel is just so low. You want to utilize input, output, decision, and verification parameters, and you want to create some standards for that. You want to make sure that you create syntax or rules governing the data input. So remember, this whole process, it must allow for multiple data iterations. So make sure when it comes to the front-end design, you must understand your audience and the customer. Who will be using the framework to design automated scripts? One of the most common mistakes I've seen when organizations are building a team to create the framework is that they just automatically assume that their team members are comfortable or know extremely well Excel. And that's just not the case. So make sure, again, that you understand your audience. Are they technical enough to understand objects, classes, and methods? If not, then you may need to expect to have to train them on those concepts in order for them to be able to use the framework. You want to design it to handle all of that in the background. Ask, make sure, do they understand test automation methodology? And then should they have to in order to use the framework? So if you've got your testers and you're able to dedicate them strictly to the front end, strictly to entering data, therefore creating tests in your Excel spreadsheet, then it's much more important that they be subject matter experts. They don't necessarily have to be an expert on test automation. Can they be trained on how to use the framework to create automated tests in 8 hours or less? They should be able to. That's what we found is our window. If we can't train somebody on how to use the framework in 8 hours or less, then our framework we've determined is overly complex. You want to use an input method that everyone in your audience understands. So whether it's Excel, database input, XML, whatever it might be. The rules or syntax required to create the automated test need to be easily understood and conveyed. If the learning curve is too difficult, it will end up going by the wayside, and your framework will then become shelfware. You want to make sure that you incorporate simple keywords. A framework should be flexible enough to accommodate most of your organization's testing projects. I say most because keep in mind, we're still going to utilize testing approaches such as exploratory testing, which is very important. If the framework is geared solely for one application, then the lifespan and usefulness of your framework is going to be very limited. And then also know the scope and expectations of automation in your organization. So if it's designed strictly for web apps using Internet Explorer, then, well, what about cross-browser testing? Are you not going to do that? And what about SAP or Oracle or some other ERP system, excuse me? And what about legacy apps using VB and ActiveX? So all picture, you've got to keep those in mind. So once you've designed the front end, you're ready to start designing the back end, and you're going to build the back end to support that front end. So how does the data get fed into the framework? How does runtime data get captured and reused? How are multiple iterations handled? So when it comes to multiple iterations, without a doubt, one of the most common mistakes that I'm sure all of you in the audience have seen is when you create an automated test to validate the login process, and specifically you are validating error message logins. Well, as we all know, it's quite common for the login process for your application, after the third invalid attempt, it locks up the application. So from an automated testing viewpoint, we've got to make sure we handle this and take this into account. Determine what type and level of reporting is created. Is it going to be tool generated or custom? Are we going to utilize screenshots? Because remember, capturing screenshots, that's going to slow your test down a little bit. I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing. You just need to take that into account. And then also very important, how are unexpected events handled? Are they handled? Last thing you want is to kick off an automated process that's going to run 500 different tests only to find out that Dream encountered an unexpected problem and it froze everything in its tracks. So some back-end design tips. Remember, it's got to be modular in design. It must be well documented and commented. Not just externally to your framework, but also in the code. Add comments. Reporting, it must be detailed, clear, and concise. If possible, as objective evidence. Remember, that's the intent. And it's got to be simple enough so that a master's degree in software development is not required for maintenance and support. Multiple applications and platforms need to be taken into consideration. Remember, do that during the design phase. Know the scope and expectations of automation within your organization. Determine that upfront with leadership. So now let's talk about applying your framework for DevOps or continuous integration. So the next steps, initially, start with getting to continuous integration and continuous delivery. Get to that point, and that is consider that a win. So don't try to eat the whole elephant, as they say, and determine, you know what, we're going to do continuous deployment right away, and we're going to give ourselves 6 months. You are setting yourself up for failure. So perhaps create a test framework that allows quickly for sizing up or down. So maybe create some 5-minute smoke test or 1-hour regression with that framework. Think about the dynamic and data-driven nature. Start with automation of unit test. So once you're able to do that, that's an excellent starting point, and then you can absolutely go from there. Automate your deployments to stage environment as soon as possible. So again, your deployment to the stage environment. Configure your continuous integration system to launch all tests based upon an appropriate event. So that event may be a build, it might be a deployment. Once you get to the point where you are releasing software on a daily basis, that's when it's a good time to look into continuous deployment. But just make sure that the rest of your organization is ready as well. Because, I'm talking about organizations such as, the documenting team, support, marketing, because those functions will have to adapt to the new cadence of releases. And it's important that they do not miss on significant changes that can impact customers. So these are definitely important factors to think about, but some great next steps if you're at the point where you are considering and researching, or perhaps you're just getting started on implementing and moving into continuous integration with the ultimate goal of getting into continuous delivery and DevOps. I am more than happy to take any questions, and if we run out of time, at the end here, there is my email address, and I'm on LinkedIn. I absolutely welcome any questions emailed to me or messaged to me via LinkedIn, and I will do my best to respond. But that being said, Ron, I'm more than happy to take some questions.
Okay, Bob, we've got several questions that have come in during the presentation. So the first one is, what has been the biggest benefits that have been realized by implementing this framework in terms of ROI, productivity, defect counts, products, budgets, and et cetera?
Great question. Thanks, Ron. So, I can tell you that one of our customers, when we first started with them, they were slowly getting their I don't want to say their feet wet, but they had just started implementing continuous integration, and they were releasing weekly, and they were having some real challenges with that because it just wasn't as reliable. Their team was having to release during odd hours, sometimes in the middle of the night, and they found that the confidence of their end users were a bit on the low side because the quality of their system was down. Once they successfully implemented a framework and were able to create a significantly greater number of automated tests, they then went from releasing once a week to 3 to 4 times per day. And one of the other side benefits of this was that those releases were truly done during the day. So their team did not have to work weekend hours. They were not working in the middle of the night. They found that the reliability of their releases increased significantly. And as a result, their end customers' confidence in them and their quality score increased significantly. So those were just some of the benefits. When it comes to defects, what everybody should expect to see is once you've implemented and are using your framework and therefore automating more processes, you should see your defect count increase. That makes sense. In other words, the number of defects that you actually find or detect should increase. Because, I mean, that only makes sense because once you've automated the process, you're then able to validate for a greater number of conditions, and you should expect to discover a greater number of defects. But those are just, you know, that's just some of the ROI and some of the value of a robust, well-implemented framework. I hope I answered that question for the audience.
So our second question is, it's kind of corollary to the first one. It says, what have you seen as the biggest challenges to implementing this framework in terms of culture, tools, knowledge, budget, et cetera?
Excellent question again. So let me talk about 2 categories of challenges, if I could, Ron. So I'm going to talk about challenges not only in regard to implementing the framework, but I want to just share with the audience some of the more common challenges they should expect to see on an ongoing basis. So implementation challenges. I would have to say overcoming the mindset that you must test everything. Everybody's got to realize that simply is mathematically not possible. Other challenges are the cost, because to convert from waterfall, let's say, or even agile into a DevOps, that's going to take significant time, effort, and money. So the expectations have to be set initially on with leadership and with the organization. This is an investment. The other thing is lack of expertise. You know, when it comes right down to it, continuous integration, continuous delivery, continuous deployment, DevOps, all of that is still relatively new in the life of IT. So there is certainly not an abundance of expertise out in the market. So finding that expertise can be a real challenge. And then perhaps the biggest challenge is getting the team itself to embrace the new strategy and culture. For somebody to say all of a sudden, oh, we're going to go from doing an automated regression test once every 2 weeks to, hey, we're going to start testing multiple times a day, that is a difficult thing for some people to grasp and therefore embrace. So those are just some of the challenges implementing. And then as far as on an ongoing basis, once the framework is implemented, continually being able to find resources with the expertise and experience can be a challenge, training current team members. And then the other big thing is keeping your team from slipping back into the old ways. So something we didn't cover is once you've implemented that framework, you have got to have some processes to ensure or enforce that your team utilizes that framework and the different DevOps processes that you have implemented. So I hope that helped, Ron.
Yes, it does. Our next question here says, in your experience, how long does it take to implement this framework?
So there are a lot of different variables and factors on that. First off, let's all agree that an automation framework in a DevOps environment is a work in process. So you're going to see it go through a lot of changes. So does it truly ever get 100% complete? No, it truly does not. We have implemented a framework in as quickly as 6 weeks, where we were able to go in, set up the front end, the back end, the drivers, educate the organization, and then leave and offer them ongoing support. Most frameworks, though, are going to take anywhere, I'm going to say, from 6 to 9 months to truly have implemented, including, the processes solidified, the documentation, and whatnot. So I think 6 to 9 months is a realistic expectation.
It's Francesco here. I would like to add even my experience on this, because I saw a lot of customers implementing this framework, or a framework very similar to this. And I totally agree with the timing that was given before, because the first change can be done in 6 weeks, so a couple of months. And after a couple of months, the people can start using the framework. But this is an ongoing process, because every new week or every new release, you have to add new tests to make automation on that. In fact, I even have a customer that he defined a methodology to define when is the case to start making the automation for the test, and usually it's the second, third rounds of the application or the feature. So even the change of the culture, so the change management, because you have to change the tool, the methodology, is something that takes 5-6 months, and this is for many customers.
That's a great point, Francesco. Thank you. I agree 100%. That makes sense.
So,
any other questions, Ron?
Yeah. The next one is, what are your recommendations for selling upper management on this framework?
So one of the things, so for those of you that are considering moving into an automation framework in the near future or down the road, one thing I would advise you to do immediately, and that is to start maintaining measures and metrics relevant to the progress that you're realizing now, so that you will have something to compare it to, whether you are comparing to other organizations that have implemented a framework in DevOps or continuous integration, as well as once you have implemented your own. Because you will then be able to provide some comparison ROI to your leadership, and that goes a long way. So start keeping measures and metrics now, and start doing research on the return on investment in implementing an automation framework. And remember, there is direct ROI as far as the hours, the resource hours saved, as well as indirect ROI. So, and sometimes that's really hard to measure and calculate, but you want to be able to say, hey, before, when we were doing it this way, we were typically finding 20 defects during one of our regression test runs, whereas now we're finding 40. Therefore, that means those defects did not get into production, So we should have happier end users as well. As part of your process, start doing some end user surveys so that you can do a before and after and make some comparisons there as well. So those are some things, Ron, that I would definitely recommend everybody to help in justifying to leadership why you should utilize this approach.
Okay, thank you. So kind of a corollary to that, are there any specific KPIs that you would use to measure success?
So the ones that I would tend to use, that I would look at, is the number of defects discovered once in production, as well as before production. I would look at the fix ratio as far as the amount of time that it takes to get a defect resolved and discovered. So those are just a few, but I mean, there are numerous. So I could, you know, if anybody wants to email me, that's something I could certainly send a lot of other additional KPIs. Any other questions, Ron?
Yes. Can you extend this framework into other areas such as performance testing?
We ourselves have not done that, to be honest with you. And you know, when it comes with when it comes to Performance Center and Load Runner, I don't, you know, I'm thinking about that a little bit. That's a great question. Again, we never have, but with Performance Center and Load Runner, I don't know that there would be significant benefits other than the type of performance testing you might do as part of a smoke test. So I'd have to research that a bit further.
Okay, thank you. We have another one here. It says, do you see people implementing this more as a SaaS, on-prem, or a hybrid solution?
More of either SaaS or on-prem. So either one, it works absolutely fine. It does not, in the design and development of your framework, it doesn't matter whether or not the licenses are on-prem or in the cloud, you know, or part of the SaaS. So any of those would work just fine. It would not be a factor in your success.
Okay. Next question is, do you have any specific tool recommendations to implement this framework?
Well, you know, obviously, I mean, Checkpoint Technologies is a Micro Focus partner. We've implemented this in other solutions as well. You know, the vast majority of what I showed during this webinar truly is tool agnostic. So if somebody wanted to use this in Selenium or any other solutions that are out there, they certainly could do so.
Okay. And we have a question here. It says, ALM already offers BPT, which can be used in a UFT framework. Would this be helpful to, or can it be leveraged as well?
No, great question. So BPT, business process testing, could absolutely be leveraged, and it would actually, you know, some of the features, benefits of BPT would take the place of some of what we might implement into a framework, so it should actually speed up the process.
Okay. And I have a question here. How does the system handle parallel execution?
So parallel execution would not be a factor, if you will, in or to the framework. The only thing that you would want to make sure of is that with parallel execution, if you've got anything writing back to the same spreadsheet, if I understand the question correctly, you know, you don't want to have two or multiple processes trying to write back to the exact same output file, that could possibly slow it down a bit. But otherwise, that would not be a factor.
Okay. And it looks like it says, can you show us an example of an Excel that's filled in? The person wanted to see how the data and the keywords were mixed in.
So there was actually a slide that I did show where it showed a little bit of data in there. I don't. Let me see. I could certainly try to go back if you all want me to very quickly on the screen. Just bear with me here. So this is an actual example of how the data, could be populated. So you see you've got different columns. So it would be very readable in pseudo-English. The key thing there for the data, the keywords, is that your organization determined the standards and the protocols and the naming conventions that are going to be used. So in other words, if there's an action within your process where somebody needs to create a record, then everybody's got to decide or agree to use the keyword of create as opposed to insert or add. So I don't know if that just answered the question, but again, if anybody would like more detailed examples, please feel free to email me. Any other questions, Ron?
No, I think this looks like this is wrapping it up for this presentation.
I hope I was able to get to everybody's questions, and there's my email address, and again, I am on LinkedIn. And Ron, thank you so much for doing such a great job moderating, and I'd like to thank the audience for joining us, and a huge thanks to Vivit, just an outstanding organization that enables us all to be better when it comes to the utilization of the microfocus solutions. So thank you, Ron and Vivit.
Bob, thank you too for this presentation. We appreciate it. And as I saw recently, they're talking about how DevTestOps is going to be the new buzzword for this year. So just thank you for this timely and insightful topic.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you and have a great day.
Thank you. And also just for upcoming webinars that we have, on February 6th, we'll be having the project report that is new in version 9.42. And testing tools. So just everyone, please fill out the survey, and we thank you for your time and joining us today. And here's the address for the survey. Thank you.